Welcome to Adapting, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is
Pat.
And KJ.
Today we'll be discussing All Quiet on the Western Front, from the novel, published in 1928 by Erich Maria Remarque, and its adaptation, All Quiet on the Western Front, from the 1930 film directed by Louis Milestone, and that year's winner of the Best Picture at the Oscar ceremony, as well as the Edward Berger 2022 film of the same name, which was also nominated for Best Picture. This book, these films, focus on the German side of the World War I conflict. We follow Paul, a first-person narrator in the book, as he goes to the Western Front, the front line, and his experiences there, not only dealing with the horrors of war, but the society that is pushing these young men into this conflict. And so we have this sort of rock and a hard place situation where the front is this confusing, devastating, horrible place, and then you have the society itself, which seems to have nothing but enthusiasm for the war and no understanding of what the war actually is. And so we see Paul, who is negotiating these spaces. And it's a pretty bleak book. The movie, the 1931, makes some changes, but essentially is capturing the same themes and spirit of the book. The characters are German, even though they do the translation convention where everyone is speaking English. And then the 2022 version isn't really following the book, and it's actually changing many of the themes, even though there is a man named Paul who is at the front, and some of the scenes are the same, and yet we have a big kind of transformation between 1930 and 2022. So I want to start with just the first impressions of this material. I could say I read this going into high school, so 1998, I believe it was, the summer of 1998, I first read this. I reread it for this show. And the only thing I remember from almost 20 years ago was the stabbing scene where Paul gets trapped in the crater with the Frenchman and has to stab him and is kind of trapped there with his body. In rereading the material, I think, Pat, maybe you had this similar response that we texted about. It feels in some sense belated. We already know what the anti-war spirit is, and the book sort of nails that on the head a bit too much. But at the same time, it does have a lot of effective things that are going on in it. And there's a lot of effective writing as well that makes it part of the modernist tradition. I don't know if this book is part of the canon, so to speak, anymore, but it is an interesting artifact. And I will say, I think the movie was far more impressive, even though, they had some qualms with the film. I think some of the performances are a little pushed, but it is a remarkable bit of filmmaking, and it's very inventive and very creative. And I honestly, I think it surpasses its source material. What did you guys think of? Let's start with the 1930 film and or the book.
This movie was phenomenal. I can't believe what is it, less than a year after The Jazz Singer, right? So some theaters got a silent version of this film because they didn't have the sound equipment. I'd love to get my hands on that, but it does not feel like one of the first talkie films at all. I think you could play it for a modern audience without any problems whatsoever. And the way it transitions from the hype of the war into the claustrophobic little bunker they're in when they're first getting shelled, and then that whistle blows and they have to go out and fight. You're like, oh, I'd rather be back in that little bunker that I thought was the worst place on earth until I got to this next scene where they do, like you had mentioned last week, Tom, that incredible editing going back and forth between the machine gun and the guys running and falling, the machine gun, the guys running and falling. That rhythm, that awful, the death that you see on screen and the magnitude of it, right? The movie is just grand in a way that I didn't know movies could be that grand back then. Today, movies don't feel that grand because of, we think, oh, special effects, we understand the tricks that are going on. They must have been blowing stuff up out in those fields,
Oh,
right? How
easily,
else
yeah.
do you, right?
They had a lot of practicals, yeah.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So I was incredibly impressed by this film through and through. Every vignette just about hit. There's some that are cornier than others. Um, yeah, so I was sitting on the couch. I was watching this on the TV, and it was that they're in the bunker and then they go out to the war. And my wife comes down the stairs and she goes, "Are you okay?" And I kind of look at her and I'm like, I don't think so. As I'm sitting here watching it, I thought it was a phenomenal film. How about you, Pat? How did you like the movie?
Yeah, I mean, I'd read the book, so like Tom, I read the book in high school. I read it in like junior year for history class. And the only thing I had similar to Tom, I only had a memory of one scene, and that was the teacher. Like I remember the teacher basically being like, "You boys should go off to war," like that scene, and then basically the rest of it. So I remember just that scene. So it is interesting reading it. It's an as a book, it's an okay book. I think the way I thought of it was like if it was the same author and he didn't write about the war in this way, he was just writing about I don't know an Arctic expedition or something, whatever. I don't think we'd read it. I don't think it would be. I don't think anyone would care. Like it's not as if it's not like some other books where say to the lighthouse. It doesn't really matter what she was writing about. Like she could have written about anything and it would still be read because of how well written it is. The topic is not necessarily as important as the way that the book is written.
So if we can jump on that for a second, it's a translation we all read in high school, right?
Yeah.
Do translators are they known like do writers who are incredible at writing often do translations?
It's not so much that the way the language, I'll agree. Obviously, I can't quite comment but it's not, you're right. It could be a translation issue. I don't think it's a translation issue. Like, I don't have qualms with like the way, because you can tell like a bad translation, usually you're like, this is just weird. Like, it's just not well constructed. It's just not great. I just don't think like, even regardless of of the words, I'm not, it's not particularly poetic, but I don't think it's meant to be. And even if it were, I don't think it would matter. I mean more just like the way in which the novel's written. Like it's a non-linear novel. It actually starts in the past and then kind of moves back and forth, and you kind of, you get sort of vignettes of the past kind of pulling into the present, this kind of stuff. It has a modernist way in which it's written. But you're right. I can't truly comment on that without knowing the language, but I just don't think it would be. I don't think that's its problem. I think its problem is more what Tom was saying, which is it really want, which is one thing. This is why I think it's an interesting adaptation because it's a lot of actually interiority. Most of it is just Paul's thinking about things. Not a lot actually happens. Like the sections where he goes out to go to war or he fights somebody or is running across, no man's land or whatever are pretty brief. And then it's just pages and pages and pages of his reaction to those things, and it's very interior and to the point where sometimes I'm like, I got it, bro. We can move on. And I think a little bit of that is that we sort of know that. I think nowadays we have that sort of ingrained in us. Like we've seen Vietnam War movies, we've seen World War II movies. We don't see a ton of World War One movies, although there have been in the last like 10 or 15 years, been more of them. But there's the horrors of war have been brought home. I don't think many people look at war nowadays and think of it the way that people might have thought of it in the 19th century as, a grand affair. A boy's got to go to war. If a boy doesn't, go to war, he's not a man. Like, and I don't think that is not a lot of people have that attitude now. And I think books like this are a large part of the reason why. So the book doesn't hit as hard as I think it probably did. That doesn't mean it's not worth reading. I just don't think it's a great work of literature, but it is a great book in sort of what it's the topic that it's exploring and the way that it explores it. And it's not a badly written book by any stretch of the imagination. If it were, we wouldn't read it. I'm sure there's a lot of badly written books about World War One. This is a well-written book about World War One. So the book is still good, and I don't mean to say that it shouldn't be read anymore, that it's like no, this one can probably go. There are books from that time period where I'm like, no, we can stop reading this one. This one's not worth our time. It's not worth our time. um but I don't think that's true of this one. So that's my take on the book. Was it was okay, but I will absolutely agree with UKJ on the movie because I kind of was like, all right, we'll do this, we'll do our 1930s movie, and I thought it's gonna be kind of that like jerky, like watching them like run across no man's land. I was kind of picturing that, and I was picturing a bunch of like wax figures kind of moving, and like that's sort of this kind of fall special effects kind of weird 1930s kind of things you sometimes get with these movies, and that's thinking I was thinking something like DW Griffith kind of movies, which those are well done movies for the time, but they do have that sort of janky quality to them. That's what I was expecting. And oftentimes, it's just like most of those movies, like you can't show that movie to most people nowadays. Like you can't go and show most D.W. Griffith movies or most of these older movies. People just aren't, most people aren't going to watch them. This one is shockingly modern. It was shockingly modern. Like I was very, very surprised to see it. Like you could more or less lift that and pop it into today, and you might need to update some of the performances. Some of the performances have that, what cat? You can't say that, cat. Like they have that sort of like, I am painfully earnest now. Like they have that sort of thing going on. So you couldn't do that. But most of especially the effects and the editing, is stunning. There's a there's a number of really powerfully edited scenes, and I'm sure the one that I think is the most is, I think it's in the early scene where like they have the guy kind of trying to climb over the barbed wire, and then they have the bomb, and then you just see his hands,
Hands
and
in
it's
there.
just like his severed hands are the only thing that's left holding on to the barbed wire, and I'm like, jeez, that's like
That
and
really
there's a
gets it.
lot of that. It is a very well done movie, and I was shocked as to how modern it feels. It really does have a feel that's just this is when I think movies really, really, really get away from just being like filming plays. This just feels like a lot of early movies sometimes feel like they're filming a play. This one absolutely is using film as a medium. That shot where they go from the exterior watching the parade go, and then they have the
Into the
camera
classroom.
moving through the window
Into the
into the
school,
into the
yeah.
school,
Mhm.
and then back. I'm like, what? I mean, like that's shocking. I'm like,
That's
that's a
so cool.
cool shot for today. That's not an easy shot to do today. And they've got much better cameras with a lot better practical things they can do with them. And I'm like, oh, you must have really like planned that one. And it's stunning how well it works. It's stunning how they got it to work and how they got the focus. It's really good. It was a shockingly good, well done movie.
Yeah. And I think the that first battle scene is so well edited. But I think I texted you guys they don't make movies like this, and I didn't mean this is so good that nobody makes good movies anymore. What I think is in modern editing, like I think of this movie was a big inspiration on the Spielberg movie about D-Day, Saving Private Ryan, and
It
that
feels
movie,
like that. It
yeah,
feels like that. Yeah.
yeah, and Spielberg said as much. And the thing with the famous sequence there, the D-Day sequence, is it's edited in such a way so you can follow Tom Hanks's crew as they go through D-Day. We get a sort of narrative, right? That's how that thing is cut together. We get atmosphere, but we're really following Tom Hanks and Sizemore and Vin Diesel and those people as they're doing the different things they need to do on the beach. And I
Actually,
think,
never had realized that was Vin Diesel. I haven't
yeah.
seen that movie since it came out.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize that was Vin Diesel till you
That
just
was
said it.
yeah, that was Vin Diesel. That's
Oh,
apparently
that's really funny.
Vin Diesel made his own movie. He like wrote and produced his own movie, and apparently it impressed Spielberg so much that he cast him in Saving Private Ryan. But and then he did 10 Fast and Furious films. But anyway, um, so that's kind of the point there. I think with modern editing, and I think with this is it kind of remind me, as I said like last week, it's like the steps of Odessa from the battleship Potemkin, which is a battle scene where it's not about following a narrative. It's about getting the feel of an atmosphere. And so you just
Yeah, the
have
chaos
the
of a battle.
chaos, yeah. And so you just have cuts back and forth of different things. And the idea of it it's part of this kind of Soviet montage theory where if you juxtapose different images together, you get an emotional feel. And so I think that went out of style as acting got better. And you're like, we don't really need to juxtapose images anymore. We just have actors do it, and it's fine. As acting improved, that kind of style of editing went out. But I think it is what they're doing here, because that battle sequence isn't about following the steps of the battle, so they know exactly where Paul is and what Paul's doing and how,
You have no idea, but and I
you
guess that's the
don't
thing is like you have no idea where they are. You have
what's
no
going
idea
on.
what battle it is. Like you don't completely know. You got a general idea of the year because you know it's about 1914 because they've just arrived, but like you have no idea where they are.
Mhm.
You know probably in Belgium somewhere in Flanders, but you just
Most
have no
likely, yeah.
idea. You
Mhm.
don't know what they're fighting for. You have no idea what they're doing there. You have no idea what the objective is because they don't. Yeah, and
Mhm.
they don't either. I guess that's the point.
Yeah.
You don't and it just doesn't matter. They didn't know, and that way they weren't. They didn't care.
Yeah, and I think the movie captures that. So it's much more interested in juxtaposing images of soldiers running out with that machine gun being loaded and like zipping past the machine gun in a front-on shot and having that kind of overhead camera angle as them running out, which is a really kind of what we would think of as more experimental, even though I think it was more probably an established style in silent film. But it captures the book well because in the battle scenes in the book, you have no idea what battle they're in the book ever. Like you know they're in a battle, but you're not sure which one it is. You don't even really know the year until Paul dies at the end when they're like, "It's October of 1918." And so it in a certain way captures the spirit of the book. I think a lot more than having a more traditional editing because it's just because it's about kind of chaos, right? It's about like this doesn't make any sense. What we're seeing just doesn't make any sense. It's endless bodies smashing into each other. It's really, really superb. And as you're saying, Pat, it even feels more modern than most modern movies because I think it's doing things that modern movies just don't do anymore.
I think even to the point where I think it was KJ, where you saying like it's the fact that we're so used to special effects, and there is no trickery here. I mean, obviously they're not really dying, but we got that. But there's no trickery. Like if you see something explode, that is someone buried dynamite and clearly had a practical, like a squib or whatever. That is a bomb. Like that's something exploding, and when you see a mass of people moving across a field, you know that is a mass of people moving across a field. Like it has just a more real feel to it than even something. And I didn't know say that this was an influence in Saving Private Ryan. It kind of guessed it, but even Saving Private Ryan has a little. It's very realistic, but it has that sort of artificiality because we know there's sort of we know what's sort of going on, and this doesn't have that.
And we know Spielberg's vocabulary for making movies. So we know we're in a Spielberg movie, even though it's chaotic in Saving Private Ryan during that beach scene. But because he's using similar techniques he used in previous movies that we've all seen, it becomes familiar as a movie. Whereas All Quiet on the Western Front does not feel familiar as a movie. It almost felt like, oh, well, maybe they were there. Like it had a much more
It has a
visceral
documentary feel
feel.
to
Hmm.
it to some extent. Like it has
Yep.
more of a Ken Burns kind of feel to it.
The other thing that's amazing about that battle scene is you see the enemies running across no man land, and your thought isn't, oh yeah, we got to shoot them down. It's, I don't want them to be hurt either. I hope they never get here, but I don't want them to die. And then when they get here, you're like, well, hang on, I don't want anybody hurt right now. Right? It's a war movie, but you're kind of on Paul's side. But even during the battle, where you should absolutely be on Paul's side and you're hoping he lives and the enemy does not, the movie doesn't seem to judge the enemy that way.
I was gonna say the enemy isn't a character, right? Like we don't have like a Frenchman with a name who's a character until the scene in which Paul has to stab somebody to death.
But they're also not a red shirt that we're okay with dying.
No, they're not stormtroopers either,
Right.
right? It's just the
Exactly.
enemy isn't the enemy. The enemy is the circumstance. And so it's, that's the problem. The people who
Yeah. You just want the circumstance to go
yeah.
away as you're watching
And
this
the
movie.
people who you dislike are people who don't understand. It's even like even it's the father, right? And you're sympathetic to Paul's father, but he doesn't get it. He wants his son to like wear the uniform and whatnot, or you hate the schoolmaster pretty easily because he's just encouraging people to die. It's the people who don't get it, or those guys, those insufferable guys who are like, no, you don't understand the war because you're in the middle of it. If you were like me
The
and had
details, of course. The details, of
yeah, yeah.
course. But that's not.
But if you just pushed on to Paris, we would be fine. Just keep pushing. Why aren't you? This is how it should be done. Like those are the people who are the villain is too strong a word because it almost seems like it's not their fault either. They're just part of this. And Paul was probably in that mindset before he went anyway. But that's the problem. It's the people who don't get it. And so the enemy, the French, presumably they get it, but they're just bullets basically. They're not people
Well,
you
the
hate.
big scene, I think, and they make this, I don't know if you noticed this, but I'm like, oh, okay, that's a clever little tie-in because they have the scene right before they go over the top is when they're like, oh, the rats, and they start like, hitting they start killing the rats, but they're
Mhm,
using their
mhm.
boots and
Mhm.
they're hitting them with the boots. If you watch when the French come over and they start killing the French, there's a guy in the background, one of the Germans, and it must, I guess the implications he lost his gun and he's taken his boot and he's beating
Mhm.
a Frenchman with
Uh,
his boot. So it's very, it's basically, it's like to them, this is the same as like rats coming in. Like they just like, "Ugh, I mean, normally I don't care, but I have to. I can't. They can't stay. It's sort of it's. But this is. I mean, I'm not
Mhm.
joking. I think that is what they're doing. It's the
Mhm.
same sort of thing of I don't really care about the rats. I wouldn't. I would leave them alone, but they can't be in here. If they're in here, I have to kill them and I have to get them out of my home. And then right after that, they go out and the French show up and they're like, well, normally I wouldn't care. If you just stayed over there, I wouldn't care. But we're here now, so I have to do this. Like it's the same general thing. I think that's sort of the implication. And they do it because otherwise they would die. And so what are they gonna do?
Yeah, they're in a circumstance where they can't get away with it. And they sort of the author sort of nails this on the head a bit in that trench scene when Paul's trapped in the carve out with that French soldier and he's talking to him and he's like, you just had people who sent you to war and I just had people who sent me to war. I don't have any problem with you. It's sort of
Like, no, I got it, bro. We
overdone in
got that.
in
By
that
this point in the
scene.
book or movie, we've
Yeah.
got it. We
Yeah.
got it.
Um,
Mhm.
which I think that scene works better I actually think it works better in both movies than in the book. But yeah, that is the sort of idea. You're not
That's a
rooting for
scene
the
that works
French.
better with no dialogue, though. I mean, that's a scene that works better with he stabs him, he kills him, and then he just stands next to him. And if he does say anything, he just says like stop it," and then keeps going to get water or something like that, and then he dies, and then he takes the papers out or something like
Yeah,
that.
and it actually works.
That's more effective. But
Yeah. And I think it works better. This is the one thing I liked more in the 2022 movie than in the book or the 2030 movie because he stabs him and then he can't stand him gargling, so he just tries to cover his mouth with mud and then he feels bad doing that, so he just tries to cover up the wound with the same mud to try and like, okay, that didn't work, so I'm just going to heal you now, and that type of thing. And it works really well. And he's not like blubbering or crying. He's just trying to solve the problem, which he's created and doesn't seem to be aware of. It's actually a pretty effective scene in a movie that I struggled a lot with. But
So tell me, I saw the 2022 version when it first came out, but my memory is it's not as anti-war as the
oh, it's
1930.
anti-war. It's
It is the
super
2022.
anti-war. Yeah, yeah.
The 2022 one is
Oh yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really, really, really anti-war. If anything, it's more so. Well, I guess you can't be more so than the book, but it is. It does it in a different way. So I think the book and the movie, the 1930 movie, and I said this before, are about the social pressure. This is why you have that chapter where Paul goes home and he sees his mom who doesn't get it, and he sees his sister who doesn't get it, and he sees his teacher who doesn't get it. And he's like completely alienated from these people because they don't understand it, and what have you. Um, you don't have that scene in the 2022 one. He doesn't go back. What you have is the teacher. What's his name? Camerick? That's the teacher? You see the teacher in the
no,
beginning.
Kemerick is the one. Isn't Kemerick the one who dies?
Well, Cat
Kemerick's the one with the boots.
is Camerick the one? Oh, Catterick. Kenterick is the teacher. I think Cantor, well, whatever. The teacher, you see the teacher in the 2022 version, but after that, you don't have any of the social space. Even Himmelstoss isn't in it. Right? Himmelstoss is also one of these people who doesn't get it. He thinks the front is a parade ground. In the 2022 movie, the drill instructor, he's kind of a difficult person. But basically, at one point, he is talking to Paul and this other guy, and he's like, Paul, you'll be dead by night. And the other guy dies that night. And so it's like, the drill sergeant kind of gets it. He's not one of these people like Himmelstoss who doesn't understand the front. And what you end up seeing with the movie, the 2022 movie, it's really weird, is there's a juxtaposition of the end of the war, the summer of 1918, and then in November, the debate for armistice. This kind of like the diplomat who went to the French from Germany to negotiate the armistice. And so you see the negotiation of the armistice intercut,
which makes no sense
which
for
makes
this
no
movie
sense.
because
Yeah.
the whole thing is you're not supposed to get anyone's perspective but the common soldier.
Yeah.
So to see any of like the negotiations makes no sense.
And it doesn't. And you also see it intercut with General Ludendorff, the general of the Germans, who is just hates the negotiations. And you get the impression that he is the one who's keeping the war going all by himself, which doesn't make any, which violates the theme of the book, which is the reason why nations go to war is because of nationalism, which is something a large group of people have to feel for that to happen. And in this 2022 version, you just get like Ludendorff's the villain, and he's kind of pushing it. It's like Wonder Woman. Ludendorff's the villain, and he's just driving everyone to war. And there's the diplomat, and he's the good guy, and he's going to save everyone. And it ends in this preposterous scene where
It's a German movie, right?
it is a German movie.
Yeah, that might explain.
It might explain. But
I suspect there's a reluctance to blame a large group of people for starting a war and a tendency to like to blame one person for starting and maintaining that war. I suspect that might be a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah, but the ending is bizarre. So the ending is the armistice was 11/11/11, right? November 11th at 11 a.m. And so in a departure from history, they have Ludendorff on November 11th in the morning go, I hate this cowardly social democrat peace. Well, are you gonna go home like weasels, or are you gonna go like men? We're gonna have one last battle just before the armistice. And so Paul and everybody runs into battle against the French, and Paul,
they wouldn't have done it.
Yeah,
they just wouldn't have done it.
Well, that's what happened. There was one actual battleship where they tried to do that, and everybody just mutinied.
It just wouldn't have done it. I didn't know that, but they wouldn't have done it. There's just no way they would have not done it.
And so they run into battle. And the idea is like Paul is so desensitized, he just does it because he has humanity left or something. And they run into battle, and Paul gets into the French trenches, but they have German lettering in them. I'm not entirely sure. And then he gets into a battle, and someone from behind stabs him. And he falls to the ground, and as he's dying, 11 o'clock chimes on the clock, which everybody can hear in the trenches despite there being a war going on. And that's how it ends, with him dying. And, there you go. It was like, for a movie that took itself very, very seriously, it was a bizarre ending. But regardless, it completely flips the themes, which is, there's this kind of problem in society, or the problem in us, so to speak, which is whatever. It's cliched, but it works pretty well. I think in the 1931, I guess you're right, Pat, they're a little reluctant in the German version to spread the guilt, so to speak.
So I have no evidence for this, but is there a chance that the German book is actually closer to the German movie, and for almost 90 years, 100 years, the Germans, the Americans just missed it.
No, it's a different plot.
They've made a completely different
It's a totally different
thing.
plot. None of these people are there. None of those perspectives are there. None of that happens.
It's only Paul and the people he's with. Everybody else, like even when you run into higher officials, which you don't very often, you don't even know their name. They're just people who irritate Paul and his friends.
But don't we have to ask somebody who's read both books?
I mean, we don't speak German, but that doesn't change what the book is. Like I
There's
don't.
no battle on Armistice Day. They don't even get there. Paul specifically
Paul
dies in
dies before,
October.
yeah, he dies before Armistice Day. There's no general. There's no discussion of any peace negotiations. Cat doesn't die trying to steal a goose.
Mhm.
It's just like none of that happens.
Mhm.
So as much as it's not a question of like tone or there's no question like none of that is there. Those people aren't there. So they can't be commenting on the generals. They're not present.
I don't know. A.W. Ween's like, I took a few liberties, you know?
You made it better. Yeah. Uh,
I mean, I think there's always a question of language, and I think language generally is going to mean more with something like poetry. Poetry, you can have radical changes, sort of what it says in terms of by changing the language. Novels tend to be more flexible, and yeah, you can certainly have, if you're reading Dostoevsky and there's some word that you change slightly, it can change the meaning of a scene, but it doesn't mean like different characters show up that aren't there. You know what I mean? Like
mhm.
you can't do that.
Mhm.
Like an author isn't going to do that. Like, Constance Garnett used to always get criticized because she used to take Dostoevsky. She didn't like how Dostoevsky wrote because he uses very, very, very long sentences. They tend to be really long and kind of convoluted. That's the style. That's what he's doing. And she was like, this is terrible writing. I'm going to shorten these. And so she used to break them all up into like discrete sentences. So you read it totally different. Like the rhythm is different. The sort of way that you're sort of getting a sense of how these characters speak is different. You don't get sort of the rambly quality of it. Sometimes they come across as a little too, like they know too well what they're talking about in her translations. But that doesn't really change the overall sense of the novel. Like the sense of the novel, you're not going to read it and be like, oh, maybe Dostoevsky really did like Germany, or like, maybe Dostoevsky didn't like, maybe he did like the Catholics. Like it's he's you're not going to
I was
get
about to
that
say the
sense.
same thing.
Yeah, he really did like Catholics, but you're not going to get that. Like that's not going to radically change. So I don't think it's the book and the first movie are close enough in their themes. Like the whole point of it is that it's war from the common man's perspective, why he joins the war, why and what it does to him. It's not about the generals, it's not about anybody else. It's meant to be like this is what happens to the common person when they're out there. And the 2022 movie is just like something different.
Mhm. I think they tried to use the armistice to create a sense of dramatic tension
Yeah.
because there isn't. I mean,
It's the same tension I said. It's the same tension of the cop that gets shot. Like I was one day away from retirement. Like they're trying to do that
yeah,
to
yeah.
sort of. And again, I don't know if part of it is because we've all got the war is bad
Mhm.
note. Like what are they going to add to it?
Yeah. Yeah, and the difference in the violence too is very interesting. I found the violence in the 1931 be to work very well. I think violence in movies tends to go astray when there's this idea that the more of it there is and the more gruesome it is, the more honest we're being. And so we're going to kind of pile on the violence in order to make in order to make you feel something, but that often is just
And romance movies
manipulation.
are better when they just have lots of, X-rated sex.
Yes,
That's
yeah,
how that works. So it's
yeah.
the same
It's a form
must
of
be true.
it's
But you know what I mean? It's like, but
pornography.
that's the
Yeah.
same, that's the same argument.
Mhm.
It's sort of like, well, romance movies, if we're going to be honest about them, we should show more. And it's like, well, that's a different kind of movie.
Yeah.
And the same thing is kind of true with this. Like,
Mhm.
if you're just showing, you know, sinews, of limbs, then they
Mhm.
sort of like, well, it's a different movie now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this movie does it really well. And I think the detail of the hands, which is very quick, you can miss that if you're not watching it carefully.
Yeah, they don't dwell on
Hmm.
it.
Yeah. And it's just I think it's just the totality of the bodies that you see just blowing up everywhere. It works. It's very effective for that reason. Um, and the 2022 version does a lot more with the violence. It jumps the shark at some point. I don't know if you agree or disagree, KJ. Do you remember the tank scene, which is where I thought it kind of jumped the shark?
I don't.
Oh,
We try to watch all the best nominees, so I was probably watching it
uh,
alongside a bunch of
yeah.
others. So
There's a scene where the French bring in tanks, which at first is pretty beautiful. It's just the front clears and then these tanks roll in, and you could see the Germans just they have never seen anything like this. And at first, like this is pretty interesting. And then what ends up happening is the tanks sort of roll into the trenches, and so you see the tanks like crushing people as they're screaming, and then people jump out of the tanks with flamethrowers and start setting people on fire. And after a while, you're like, ugh, this is this is just kind. I know what you're doing. You're trying to.
It's got a little bit of a Wolfenstein
Yeah,
feel.
yeah.
It's
It feels pornographic. That's what it felt like. It felt like violent pornography. Um, and I don't know what you guys thought of the violence in this movie. In the 1930 film rather, it doesn't do that at all. And it's odd. The book is also really good with the violence, right? The book doesn't dwell on violence either. It dwells on Paul's thoughts about things. But I think one of the more effective scenes in the book is when they find that naked torso in a tree. There's one point they find a naked torso in a tree with a helmet, and they're just kind of like, "Why is it naked? Oh, it was blown out of its clothes by bombs, and so now it's sitting in a tree." And then he kind of casually observes, "Oh, it's missing its legs," and then they move on.
And they just
They just
moved
move
on.
on.
They're like, no, they're like, because yeah, they're more curious. They're like, why is it?
Yeah, why
Yeah,
is he
why doesn't have
naked?
any clothes on? It doesn't make any sense. Why would
Yeah.
that happen? They have no concern of who it
Mhm.
was. They have no concern about getting the body
Mhm.
down. They're just like, why is he
Yeah.
naked? And cannot figure
Yeah.
that one out. And then
Yeah.
yeah, oh, he got blown out of his
Oh, yeah,
clothes.
that happens. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah. And then they're like, oh yeah, that happens. And then they just go
yeah.
on.
And I think they even say we're not going to get it down because that's somebody else's job and we don't want to take their job away.
Yeah,
They don't want to take the stretcher job away. Which is great because they don't dwell you don't get you don't get a strong description. All you know is I think they describe it as squatting, that he's got a helmet and then later he has no legs. They're not that interested in the gruesome details. Um, and it's also there isn't a lot of interiority about the violence. It's usually he dwells on it in a general way, but any specific detail of it, the book tends not to zoom in on too much. Uh,
the thing I love in the book, which they didn't, I didn't know if they'd have it in the movie. They didn't. Is when they go to it's early. I think it's one of their first bombardments, or maybe it's one of the first bombardments after I think Kemrick dies or is dying, and they take his boots. And they go and they basically are like they start getting shelled and on their way to the front, and so they're like, oh, we got to run and take cover, and they take cover in a graveyard,
mm,
and then they start
yes.
shelling the
Mm,
graveyard, and so all the corpses in the coffins start blowing up around them, and so they're literally being like showered with coffin bits and like dead bodies of like people, and they're like, "All right, this is great. We've got some cover." And they like, start getting under the like
mhm,
coffins, and it's just like this is really
mhm.
disturbing.
Yeah.
And it's a good
Yeah.
scene.
Now, it reminded me of like the ending of Moby Dick, right? That the coffin comes up and saves them. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the same kind of irony too. Yeah, that is, and that's another. Yeah, you're right.
oh, isn't it Queequeg? Because doesn't Queequeg? I forgot about that. Queequeg doesn't he? Is it Queequeg who makes his own
Yeah, and what
coffin?
happ's is the only thing that survives from the
Yeah,
ship
yeah,
is the coffin.
yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that. Ishmael
Yeah,
grabs onto the coffin. I
yeah,
forgot
that's what
about
I
that.
remember. That was the image that came to mind during that scene. I'm like, oh, that's yeah, it's hanging on to the dead to prevent yourself from
Yeah,
drowning. Yeah.
but that was, I mean, I just thought, like, but that's a good scene. But again, you could make that a lot more
Mm,
gruesome or just sort of disturbing, but there's no like discussion of it. It's just sort of like, oh, we're just going to hide under these
mm,
coffins and hide under these dead bodies because they'll
yeah.
provide us cover. And they just kind of, that's the
Mm,
reality. And there's no further discussion of why that's
mm,
disturbing. It's disturbing. We're going to leave it
mm.
there. And then they move on.
Yeah, it seems like his endless thinking happens off the front, right? It's almost like the front happens too quickly. The battle scenes happen too quickly for him to really think about how disturbing it is. We just get the action, which is when the book is at its best. The book is at its best when it's not reflecting on things as much, because he doesn't really have that much to say about the horrors of war. Or like Paul's observations about it are, you know, fairly banal. You don't need them at all. I think the book would be greatly improved if he, you know, stop thinking about, try to stop trying to reason things out. There's nothing really to say. And so I think those sequences are probably what makes the book survive, because it's a really interesting scene with the coffins, or with the body in the tree. And I think it's another thing that makes the book survive too, is the vignette style of it, that we don't really, that the movie has to change in a little bit. And we could talk about now the quality of adaptation, because the book is more like scenes from a war. It's not linear in any way. It's not that interested in being linear. We don't get the before and after. We get a lot more of that in the movie. And
The movie wants to show his
Mhm.
progression from doe-eyed recruit to hardened whatever, hardened veteran, and then that sort of like brief moment of his attempt to grab the innocence of the
Yeah,
butterfly
yeah.
again. It's
Mhm.
like, that's a pretty obvious thing. But that's what I think it's
Yeah,
really
and you have to
doing.
do that for a drama. You have to show a
Yeah,
sort
and
of.
I mentioned this when we were talking about last week. I think you have to, otherwise you have to have
Mhm.
progression.
Yeah, you have to show that. Um,
You don't have to, but I think they thought they had to.
Yeah, I guess you don't have to, but you want to show how it evolves over time. I guess you could just kind of jump back and forth or what have you. But I think this works fine as it is. Um, yeah, that's one of the big changes. Um, the other one, which I think it sucks they changed it. Actually, I wish they kept this, which is when the professor gets called up and they turn
Yeah, I was
him
waiting for that.
into and they start talking to him the way he talked to them. So in the book, they don't have this in the film, in either of the film versions, but in the book, Cantoric the professor, he sort of encourages everyone to join the war effort. And so later, after they've been to the front, he ends up either getting called up or joining the war effort. I don't know why he didn't join earlier, but um, and
I think he's supposed to be like home guard, I think is the
oh, okay.
implication. Like I think he's supposed to be like, but
Yeah.
anyway.
And so then they have to start training him. And so they just start saying things to him that they would say in class. Like, oh, you'll never amount to anything, Cantoric, with that attitude. They just start echoing him. And it turns into this, like, you can imagine this kind of like out of shape professor guy, like trying to run and do drills and try and follow the dictates of these students who just despise him. And it's actually, it's a bit of a levity. It's kind of funny in the book. They don't do this in the movie, I think, because the actor they cast looks like he's about 80. So I think watching him do drills it would probably be too absurd. But I wish that was a change I wish they didn't make. Um,
I also don't know if I agree it's a moment of levity. There's a couple moments of levity. And I don't think and this might be another thing of it's hard to change tones like that in a movie. Like it's a lot harder to make that shift. You can do it in a book pretty easily, but I think in a movie, especially a movie like the 1931, it's a lot harder to do that. Like Saving Private Ryan is a close one. It does have, some sort of joke moments. Like it can sort of have some fun, but I don't know if a movie like this can do
mm,
that.
yeah, that may be the answer there.
Did anybody else also get any like Starship Trooper like vibes from the teacher? They
Yeah,
have to have been stealing
yeah.
from that. Like again, it just that is very. I'm like
Yeah.
they must have
That
been
would
stealing from
be
that in Starship
so much
Troopers.
fun to do the Starship Trooper adaptation. Just they just change everything for though they don't change nothing but the tone and the purpose. Um, but yeah, I got a little of that kind of thing. I haven't read the book, but I got the
I've heard the book is just very like it's a commentary on fascism in the same way that the movie is, but it takes it up very
no. The
seriously.
book is a
Um,
celebration of the military. The movie,
I thought it was
no.
anti-fascist.
The the book is a
Oh, it
cel.
is
Well, it's not a
fascist.
celebration of fascism per se. It's a celebration
The
of
fascism,
of
yeah,
like of
militarism.
militarism, right? Like you need to, the military is a good thing. We need it. And the movie,
Oh,
yeah,
I
the
didn't
movie
know
is just
that.
like that's fascist. We're gonna mock that. So the movie completely flips the book. It
Oh, I
completely,
didn't
yeah, yeah.
know that. I thought it was just that the book took itself very seriously, but that the point was still supposed to be parody by how seriously it takes itself.
No.
Whereas this is just so absurd. I like that movie is
Yeah, no,
great.
the absurdity of the movie is commenting on the absurdity of the source material.
Oh, I
Yeah,
did not know that.
but
Another
yeah,
season.
another season. That would be an interesting season. But anyway, oh, another adaptation. It isn't a change, but an adaptation I think that worked really well is the French Girls scene when they visit the French girls. I loved how when you see Paul saying goodbye to her, you don't actually see it. They're just shooting the wall outside of their bedroom and you just hear it come in. Like that's really, really interesting choice to make. And it works really well. It has a sort of lyric feel to it. I don't think you'd even see it in a movie today. They would just be too concerned showing the actors actually talking or whatnot. But it's this moment of it's not realistic. It feels more dreamy, but it's really, really effective way of communicating. Do you remember what they do with the 2022 version, KJ?
No, I don't. What do they
They
do with
they
that
don't
one?
go. They like wait for the French girls, but only one of them, and not Paul, sees the French girl, and he comes back with like her underwear, and he lets everyone smell the underwear, and then he wears it as like a neckerchief, and then when he dies, Paul takes it and he wears it as a neckerchief, and then after Paul dies, there's like a soldier who's collecting the dog tags, and he sees Paul, and Paul is holding it like the underwear, and so the soldier looks at it, looks at Paul, and then he takes it as his neckerchief. And you're like, why is this smelly underwear so so ennobled by the war? It's really weird change.
Audience, after we talked last week about our awards, we were briefly talking about wouldn't it be funny to put cliff notes together and then include one thing in there that didn't actually happen. Tom, this feels a
Jesus.
little bit like you added something so that when I go to work tomorrow or something like, hey, did you guys see the 2022 version? All I'm going to talk about is this weird thing. And they're going to be like, what are you talking about?
No, that is in the movie.
Like you didn't catch the panty snatcher, like like all the panty snatching that the Germans were doing.
But he wears it around. He wears it like a neckerchief around his neck after the guy dies. Uh, it's real weird. Um,
Whoever writes this is just dumb. Like I'm sorry, whoever writes this is dumb.
yeah.
Like that is just stupid, and someone who thinks they're so
Mhm.
smart, and it's really
Mhm.
dumb.
Yeah.
Like that's asinine.
Yeah, I don't, it's so like it's the last thing you see. Like Paul dies holding this
Like
underwear.
that's that's what you're gonna end on. Like it was asinine to have it to end on that. But what? That sounds like
You
a
know, the
dare.
symbolism of
That sounds like a
the...
dare. Like someone was like, "I dare you to end with him stealing panties from around the neck from Paul's neck," and someone was like, "Dude, I'm writing it. Das ist gut, schnell." Like, this is what we're doing. Like, and we're gonna win an Oscar for this.
Ah, Lord. Yeah. So that kind of thing I didn't like.
Was it nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay? I bet you it
Was it?
was.
It was nominated for Best Picture.
I'm
Probably.
just taking a guess. Like it just seems like something
Mhm.
that would be nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay.
It won cinematography, best original score. Actually, the score was pretty fantastic in it. Production design. Um, let me see its nomination. It did not get nominated for best original
It
screenplay.
just strikes me as something people they would say was
Yeah,
great.
I will say the thing I liked about this, I don't know, KJ, if you remember this, is the score. The score is pretty fantastic in that movie.
I don't, but who is the head German guy?
Ludendorff, the general?
Did they cross his path too? Like, since I remember.
Uh,
On the 11th hour of the 11th. Audience, I'm holding my hand up as if I'm holding something.
I suspect they're doing Ludendorff because he was a pro Hitler, not like he was with Hitler. He was with Hitler during the beer hall push. He was like a very early supporter of Hitler. Now he eventually sort of was disillusioned, but he was a supporter of Hitler back in his Munich days. So he's an again. I'm guessing there's something about this here where they're making a direct link there. I think they're making a link between warmongering and individual war
Hmm.
leaders.
That's what they're going for.
I I think and I think that's the reason if it's Ludendorff, that's why they're doing him specifically because he does have a direct link to the beer hall push.
Because he's the next, yeah, he helps with the next generation that brings in war.
Yeah.
And I think it is about individuals who create war as opposed to social circumstances that create war. That seems to be what's going on there. Um, in the 2022 movie, which is, and then there's good people who can stop the war, like the diplomat who actually was a historical figure also, I just forgot his name, who rushes in to kind of save the day. They also do have another thing with the signing of the treaty when they're sitting down with the French, where the diplomat is like, you can't make the stakes this high. You're going to have people hate the peace. This is going to cause problems in the future. And then the French general's like, "You are telling me the standards of peace, or that type of thing." So you're like, "Oh, there's another little clue as to what's going to happen in the future."
Maybe that was supposed to be John Maynard Keynes.
Oh,
Maybe he was. Maybe
and
that was
maybe
what
there's
they
a
were going
British
with.
guy there. They don't tell you his name, but maybe.
If he says something like that, I bet they're going. They're like, that was
Hmm.
Keynes.
Yeah, of
It's,
course, Keynes would be a hero in this movie, but
yeah.
that's another issue we don't have to uncover right now. Um, but it's a completely different change, and it's not just the plot stuff, it's just the direction or the focus of how we're going to credit these things. It's very strange, and I was with the movie a lot because it is a gorgeous looking movie and it sounds great. You get a lot more. I think the horrors of war are less eye-rolly in the 2022 version when you're in the hospital and you could hear the sounds of things going on. When you're not actually looking at things, you just hear like the complaining and the groaning all at once. That kind of sound design works really well, but the visual elements end up getting kind of draining.
The one of the moments I really like that the movie, the 30s movie gets that the book that I thought it was a little corny in the book, but it's more or less it's pretty much taken verbatim, is the discussion that they're having about like why do wars start? And they're like, well, it's when one country gets mad at another country, is offended by another country. And they're like, how could a hill in Germany get offended by mad at a plane in France? And they're like, well, I bet it's the Kaiser. And they're like, well, why would the Kaiser? He has everything already. Why would he want a war? They have this whole thing. And then one of them's like, I think it's like a fever. Nobody really wants it, but once you get it, you have to just deal with it. And that's what it is. We all have a fever and we're just burning it off. And we're just the consequences of burning off a fever. And it does give it sort of and this I think gets back to the point you're saying before, Tom. Like there's a feeling of collective madness that we all have a fever and we're just the consequences, like we're just the side, the the side flack whatever here going on, and that's what causes war. But I find it, but they have no idea why they're at war. They're literally, they can't even vocalize it. There's no sense of what they're doing there.
Yeah, yeah. They just know they want to defend the fatherland, or at some point they knew that, and now when they actually have to understand what that means or articulate what that means, and they have no idea.
They have no sense. Their teachers didn't
Yeah.
tell them that.
Yeah. He just got them to join up. Um, Last thing I wanted to touch on, unless anybody has anything else to say, was the other films that were nominated this year. Which I looked through some of them, but like,
I tried looking through them. I never heard of most of them, and I couldn't find them.
yeah, well, some of it was interesting. Like it was the best director, Lewis Milestone beat Clarence Brown, who did Anna Christie. That's the year Anna Christie came out. And then you had like
The guy who
Keaton.
played Cat apparently was in the Broadway production of Harry VIII.
Oh, was he? Oh,
Yeah.
he looks like he would fit into that production very well.
Apparently
Uh,
he was a it popped up on my when I was like on my Prime thing, and it was like trivia about this person. And apparently the reason because his face does, because I noticed, I'm like, his face does look very flat. Apparently he
mhm,
was like a football player and he basically just got his face smashed in. And
mhm,
so he eventually was picked up as an actor, and he played a lot of these kind of roles, but it's just sort of like a tough, no, knowledgeable
mhm.
guy. But yeah, he was in Harry VIII.
No, very cool. Um, a lot of these movies, though, are a little like Disraeli is a historical epic about, you guessed it, Benjamin Disraeli. And The Big House is another one of these things of a person in an unjust circumstance, in this case in prison. But a lot of these other ones were like The Divorcee or The Love Parade from Ernest Lubitsch, uh, or a lot of the other ones like King Vidor had a musical, Hallelujah, that was nominated this year, and The Divorcee was another one that was nominated for best direction or whatnot. There's like a lot of these like um 1929, we're all having a fun time and everything's going great movies, and then there's this movie mixed in with them. And it is seems like a really interesting year where they're celebrating a lot of pictures about women, but also a lot of these kind of musical, fun comedy type things. And the winner is All Quiet on the Western Front, which is it's an interesting timing because it's there seems to be this kind of like 1920s energy going into this year, and you have this movie that's sort of reminding people of the potential horrors of the world. And then, it's 1930, which is going to lead into quite a bad time. So it is a very interesting Oscar year that seemed to come out of that. It would be fun to watch through all of these movies and try and get a sense of what people really liked back then. Because it does seem to be a mixture of like, we're all having a good time with the occasional social commentary thrown in.
Well, all these movies would have been made before the stock market crashed, but the
Yeah.
award ceremony would have been
Yes.
after.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So it's just a really interesting kind of like, it's a really, really specifically interesting period because it's like things are going to get really, really bad, and they've started to get really, really bad. But these are all movies from a time before anyone knew about the Depression. And so it seems like a fun collection of movies. Um,
I also think it's interesting now. I haven't seen any of those other movies, but sometimes my criticism of Best Picture award is that this movie will not be watched later on,
mm,
except that it's a Best Picture movie.
mm,
There's a reason why the other 9 movies that were nominated that year are kind of hard to find. You can't really find them. I suspect if I wanted to go find like The Great Ziegfeld, which was a few years after this one, like I imagine it's not great, but I imagine I could find it. If I want to find it, I could find some of these other winners. um, this movie, though, does feel like a movie that would have survived no matter what. If it had lost this particular year and didn't win, this movie would still be around. I
mm,
have no doubt we would still be watching this movie.
mm. Yeah.
This is one of the cases where it's not the Academy finger wagging saying you should have been watching this movie. This is like, nah, we saw this and we knew this was the best. Like I really feel like they are this was the best
Mhm,
movie that year, and that this is the one that future generations will watch. This was
mhm,
not them trying to convince you to watch something else. This was an acknowledgement of quality.
mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. Um, and it's also interesting that there seems to be also something of a divorce. You don't see a lot of the Best Picture nominees also getting Best Director. Um, you get it with The Divorcee and with nothing else. And with this film, All Quiet on the Western Front, that won Best Picture and Best Director. But like Anna Christie, the director got nominated, but the film didn't get nominated. So there seems to be this still understanding that the movie is something spearheaded by the producers and the production company. And the producers here are kind of a who's who of famous producers. And actually, Ernst Lubitsch, who was nominated for Best Director, also produced the movie. So he was nominated for Best Producer as well for The Love Parade. So I think there's also a sense that we're not really necessarily appreciating yet the auteur director. There's still this idea of the movie as an event, which makes sense that this movie was the winner because this movie is quite an event, unlike what seems to be the case with a lot of these. If you enjoyed All Quiet on the Western Front and are looking for more adaptations of All Quiet on the Western Front, check out the 1979 CBS miniseries starring Richard Thomas and Ernst Borgnine, as well as Donald Pleasant and even Ian Holm. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss depression and escapism by exploring It Happened One Night from the 1930s.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing It Happened One Night. Pat, if you could give It Happened One Night an award, what award would it be?
So I would give it the best argument to bring back the feng hua. I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows
You
what
have
the
to explain
Yeah,
that
I know.
to our audience.
So now I have to explain what the feng hua is. So the feng hua bus used to be the bus that was the Chinatown to Chinatown bus, and it ran from Chinatown in Boston to Chinatown in New York and back and forth. That's it. It had no other destinations. That was all it ever did. And I rode that thing like I must be 50 times. Like I rode it so many times going back and forth to New York. But unfortunately the buses kept crashing and they had a lot of accidents. And then the fleet basically got, they told them that the buses were literally like cracking and falling apart. And so they got pulled off the road. So the Feng Hua went out of business, I think in like 2013, 2014, something around there. But I used to ride it constantly. And then I started riding the Bolt bus, which the Bolt bus also went out of business. So I have an inordinately large number of hours spent on buses. So I actually kind of appreciated this movie. So we'll talk about it next week. But I actually appreciated the bus aspect of this movie.
Did you know it's actually the Feng War, but in Boston they just call it the.
Oh my God. How do you like them apples? That's all we say here. That's all we say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about you, Tom? What would you give it?
So I went with best, or no, I'm gonna go with worst vegan diet, because I think most of what they're on throughout this movie is just carrots and potatoes. And I think that is, if you can go on a vegan diet, that is probably the least appealing way to advertise it. So that'll be my award.
But what if you peeled them? The potatoes and carrots. Would it be appealing then?
Oh. Audience, I hope you come back next week after all these jokes we have.
How about you, KJ? What do you have?
So, well, maybe we'll get into it next week, maybe not, but I don't think this movie deserves an award. So I just had a question for you guys instead.
Wow.
Did all hotels in the 1930s have ropes long enough to span the room? And maybe this is spoilers. Maybe we shouldn't get into it.
He brought it with him, doesn't he?
All newspaper guys carry ropes long enough to span like that's just a common thing newspaper guys had. Like this is a very strange. I was always like,
when Sam was on his way to Mordor, he said the only thing he wanted was rope. When you're traveling from Miami to New York, carry rope.
And all newspapermen are descendant of Samwise Gamgee. That must be what's it.
Yeah,
that's why he wants potatoes.
Potatoes. I'd love to hear Clark Gable try to do that speech.